Enzo Maresca is signed by Chelsea on a 5-year deal. What do you make of this? Is he the right man?
Well, it's confirmation from my colleague Sam Wallace of a story that we obviously expected. I think there's going to be a formal announcement tomorrow that Chelsea have appointed Maresca. And as you say, that's the big question: is he the right man? I mean, the new owners of Chelsea, relatively new owners of Chelsea, have gone through 4 or 5 managers already in 2 years, and now they've given Maresca a 5-year contract with an option for another 12 months, which most of us would think, judging by their track record, is wildly optimistic. They've given huge contracts, lengthy contracts to players, and now they're doing that with managers. A 5-year contract with another year is a very long contract to offer a manager. Some people will go back to that 7-year deal that Newcastle gave Alan Pardew, and that didn't quite work out. But we've got to be a little bit more optimistic about it. He seems to fit the profile of exactly what they're looking for. Clearly, Mauricio Pochettino didn't fit that profile. Maybe some people more cynically would say he might be a more malleable prospect than Pochettino. Chelsea will argue that he fits more the style of play that they want, the type of football they want to play. But also there's the Pep Guardiola factor. Everyone is thinking they want a Guardiola-style manager. And I think they're looking at Maresca and thinking, well, he's worked with Guardiola. He's learned from him. He's obviously been at Leicester for a year. He's got them back into the Premier League, playing possession-based football. Maybe a little bit of that magic will rub off, and they'll get that effect going forward with a young manager who's got a big future ahead of him. But it must be regarded as a bit of a risk. You know, I don't think it's a name that will excite too many fans. But at the same time, it looks like one that Chelsea have gone for because he fits their profile of what they want to do, and maybe not as abrasive or not as demanding as somebody like Pochettino was, and obviously some of his predecessors, such as Thomas Tuchel.
Yeah, I guess, Riyadh, the key point here is that he's an apprentice of Pep Guardiola, and we've seen what Mikel Arteta has done. We've seen, Vincent Kompany obviously was under him as a player. Anyone who's worked with Pep Guardiola they'll be hoping that some of that stardust has rubbed off onto the likes of Maresca.
Absolutely. You kind of go through the game's history, and you do have these managerial figures who they take on this sort of mythical presence, don't they? They're sort of their dogma and their teachings that sort of echoes through the years, and sort of Pep's very much that figure. And again, the other story today of Kompany and Bayern Munich, I suppose, is quite an extreme example of that, on the back of getting relegated with Burnley. I mean, everyone's trying to just sort of feed off that magic a little bit. With Maresca, I'm actually quite surprised by it. He hasn't got a long background in management. Clearly, he's got a long time under Pep's wing, and that would seem to be the sort of decisive factor here. But 5 years, that feels like a gamble. That's a long contract to give to someone who hasn't managed in the Premier League. So he comes in actually having to kind of prove himself in a way, and on a 5-year contract as well. I mean, look, I'm sure many of us haven't made much of a secret of the surprise around getting rid of Pochettino, or a mutual parting of the ways with Pochettino just when he seemed to turn a corner there. And I know Chelsea fans will be excited, or seem to be excited, by Maresca, the way, the kind of football that he plays, that Pep factor. But there's also been a certain amount of disgruntlement and shock about Mauricio Pochettino going. So he has to be able to sort of ride the hangover of that as well. People are going to be looking at it and saying, well, is this an upgrade? Sure, having watched Leicester play last season, I thought, yeah, that's an extremely good team. They've won the championship, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're the right man to go into one of the most combustible clubs in the Premier League, with an ownership team and sporting directors who themselves have thrown up far more questions than answers about their own competencies. So for Maresca to kind of go into that environment, he faces a really tough task now to succeed. And I'd hope he's given time, because as Jason rightly says, he looks like he's got a great future ahead of him, but he's got a hell of a job on.
He certainly has. I mean, Jason, Riyadh called it combustible Chelsea. I mean, it's a 5-year contract. We know that Chelsea managers don't always see out the length of their contract. They get sacked before that. But is this an indication from the ownership that they're showing some faith? We want you for the long term. Are they at least alluding to the fact that we need to give someone time?
Absolutely. I think it's a very deliberate move by them to make it be public that it's going to be such a long contract. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's them just telling the world, actually, we're just going to reset here. We're just going to try and do things a little bit differently with the coach. And maybe we've gone through too many coaches too quickly. I think in the 2 years, he'll be the 5th coach under the Boli Eghbali regime. And obviously prior to that, with Roman Abramovich, coaches didn't last very long at Chelsea. I can't remember the last time anyone saw out a length of period such as this, but clearly they want to send that message out that this guy is for the long run, this is for the long term. Obviously, everyone will look at it quite cynically and think, well, actually, the reality is if he struggles at the start of next season, he'll be gone as well. But clearly, to be fair to Chelsea, they want to give that message out, and they want to show everyone that they're going to put their faith in this coach, and they're going to try and play this style of football that they want, that they feel perhaps works a little bit more for them with these young players that they've got, and actually maybe sort of reset their own project and take a bit more time about how they're going to do stuff, because they've been in a hurry so far and it hasn't quite worked for them. But I think it's a big gamble, but it's one they've obviously decided that they want to try and create a different environment or create a different message, create a different image of what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, just wondering what kind of squad, because it looks like a strong squad on paper, Riyadh, that Chelsea squad. You stick a goal scorer in there and it looks formidable, especially the way Chelsea finished the Premier League season. But they might have to get rid of one or two. There's Conor Gallagher who's been linked to PSR, kind of looms large in the background. You just wonder whether he can hang on to all that talent in his squad as things stand.
They certainly have to make changes. I find the goalkeeper situation interesting there. I think there have been a few questions about Petrovic this season. Obviously, they signed 2 keepers last summer. So, if we were to try and sort of put Chelsea's issues in sort of microcosm, you almost look at the kind of indecisiveness there. But, they might well go into the market for another keeper. Thiago Silva's finally called time. So they've got a spot there at centre half. I look up front, and I think Nicholas Jackson actually had his moments. I don't think he's necessarily the clinical scorer that team needs, but I do think they create plenty. So it's not an enormous. It's not a wholesale change that needs to be made there. I think in terms, I think they would benefit from having a more effective striker up front, but the more fundamental issues about what you do with the players you've got there. Sort of Enzo cost north of 100 million, was incredibly ineffective. I think Caicedo came on quite strong towards the end of last season, in fact very strong, but you need to be able to find a way of pairing those two together. I think in terms of who you mentioned there, Conor Gallagher, getting rid of him I think would be just a colossal mistake from the point of view of his role in the team, because he was, along with Cole Palmer, I would make him Chelsea's best player last season. I think from a PR point of view, if they're trying to win over the fans, it would be an almighty blunder, irrespective of what benefit it does on a PSR calculation, which to date I've never heard anyone in the crowd singing about PSR calculation. So they might want to sort of swerve that misstep, but they've ummed and ahed about that for months now. So it's a thought in their minds, and you hope one they think better of.
But given the PSR situation and also the volatility of the Chelsea ownership, just how punchy a call by Maresca is this, Jason? Because he could have stayed where he was, much as Kieran McKenna has done. The team he's would have come up with would have been in fairly decent shape. He would have had a lot of momentum and a lot of money in the bank, as it were, a lot of credit in the bank. He's suddenly making this move. To what extent do you think he would have weighed that up?
I think that's a really good point, and it's been slightly lost in all the stories around, what Chelsea want and if he's the right man for Chelsea and so on and so forth. Are Chelsea the right move for him? And I think, I would tend to agree with you. You've just gained promotion with Leicester City. in your first season as a manager. Kieran McKenna's in his second season, 2.5 seasons, in fact, and he's decided to stay with Ipswich Town. He feels that's a better for his development as a coach. He's slightly younger than Maresca, but similar age, similar experience. So it's interesting that Maresca has decided to go for Chelsea. Obviously, the stories we had last week were that Chelsea had decided against McKenna. There were then conflicting stories that McKenna had decided against Chelsea. But clearly, Chelsea have plumped for Maresca. Maresca has taken a gamble. You know, he's a risk. It's a huge risk in many ways. He could get burnt quite easily at this club. He could be exposed quite easily at this club. And we talk about players and whether or not he can hold on to players. I would ask the question, how much say will he have in those players staying or going? And I doubt he'll have an awful lot of say. I think he probably have a lot of those signings and those sales imposed upon him. I think the situation clearly is that Chelsea want someone to work as a first team coach out on the training pitches, to coach the players he's given and to get on with it, really. Now, the one good thing he's got going for him, he's being allowed to bring in a lot of his own staff, which again is quite interesting. Again, that's going to be an expensive move from Chelsea. But it's a gamble, as you rightly point out. You know, he's a young coach. He's just starting off. We know the volatility at Chelsea, with the demands, expectations at Chelsea. You know, they finished strongly this season. They'll expect a strong start to next season. They'll expect to build on that work. Obviously, most of us were sitting there thinking, right, okay, they're finally getting it right here. Pochettino can build on this next season. Now they're going to have to start all over again with a new coach, a different style of football, and somebody who's completely alien to them. They haven't really had this sort of coach before. So it will be really interesting to see how that works out. But I do agree with you. I think it is a risk for Maresca in terms of what it means for his own career and future. And also it's slightly sad that he's decided to leave Leicester after Leicester gave him the chance. And what was interesting towards the end of last season, there were lots of murmurings about him moving on and perhaps other clubs coming in for him. And it seemed to me that he was quite a restless character and maybe was looking to make the move himself, and that he's jumped to this opportunity.
Yeah, the flip side, Riyadh, I guess, and Jason calls it a gamble, is that this is a guy that backs himself. But what do you also make on the point of, you know, what Jason made about Leicester? It's a shame Ipswich are coming up with a manager with momentum. Leicester are suddenly scrambling around looking for one.
Yeah, I feel for Leicester in this, and I agree with both yourself and Jason as well that it's a gamble on Maresca's part, in the same way that I thought it would have been a gamble for Kieran McKenna to leave Ipswich. You know, it's nothing like taking yourself from a situation in an environment where everyone loves you and has, you know, reason to celebrate what you've done, and then immediately put yourself in a new situation where questions are going to be asked. I don't see Maresca's situation as terribly different to McKenna's at all, actually.